Okay, so good day, my friends. My name is Luke Greenaway, and welcome back to season two of the Game Dev Show, where I have the pleasure of sitting down and speaking with some of our industry's most incredible people about, well, themselves, basically. And this week, I'm joined by Professor of Interactive Media and Games and Director of the Game Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California, Tracy Fullerton. Tracy, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Thanks for having me.
A pleasure, absolute pleasure. I have to ask, as the first professor we've ever had on the show.
Am I really? Oh my
you
goodness.
you are. We've had people on the show who have worked within teaching and education from like different parts of their career, but you're the first professor we've had on. And I just wanted to know, like, what were you like at school? Were you well behaved?
Oh, yeah. Oh my God. I was a rule follower. I loved rules. I don't know why. I was a big rule follower. But weirdly enough, my friends were all rule breakers. So I got a healthy experience on both sides of the behavior fence, so to speak.
Nice.
I was always the person saying, we shouldn't be doing this.
Everyone needs someone like that, though. You need that person in your life. I was terrible at school. I was always on like school report to the head of year, and I just didn't have the attention span, I think. So
I think I had it really easy because I just charged ahead of. I was usually like so far ahead in the lessons that they would send me off to the library to just entertain myself.
Oh, really?
So they sent me through all the extra material, and then I finished that. And then they're like, just go to the library and read books. And so I went to the library. I read all these books on inventors. I remember reading that Thomas Edison, this is probably apocryphal, but had read a foot of books a week. And so I measured off the shelves in the library and started reading as many books as I could per week. And the funny thing is I started in the science fiction section. So I was reading like, Asimov and Bradbury and Arthur C. Clarke. I was going in order, obviously. That changed everything for me. That was, I think, the beginnings of who I am.
That's amazing. That's great. What a marker to set down for yourself, though. Like, it's such a high standard to maintain.
When you're a kid, you don't know. You don't know that's crazy.
So. Oh, that's so cool. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk all about your career. Before you started on your journey, I suppose, within games, you actually studied theatre arts and English literature.
Yes, that's right. Yes, and film. Yes.
And film, yeah. And was that your passion? Like, what led you to focusing on these?
Obviously, I loved reading. So there's the English literature for you. And I will tell you right off the bat, I did not love theater arts. I did not love acting or anything like that. But the thing was where I went to school at UC Santa Cruz, which is a kind of experimental, kind of hippie school, right? In Santa Cruz, the film and nascent, the very teeny tiny digital media is what they called it, was part of theater arts. It was so small that it was a niche inside of theater arts. And so that's why I have a theater arts degree. But the funny thing about that is, so while I was getting on some, I studied really super early digital editing systems and, really interested in how computers could make entertainment. But while I was doing all that and making experimental films, like hanging outside of windows, filming, doing crazy, crazy stuff in the woods with cameras and digital media. While I was doing that, I also had to take the horrible acting classes, which I was an introvert. I mean, how many game designers are not, right? But so I was an introvert and I had to take acting and dance. Oh my God, dance, which was like torture to me.
Yeah.
But turned out in the weird way of the world to be super important because I think I might have just sat in the corner and read books if I hadn't taken those classes and dared myself basically to start doing things like talking to people.
Yeah, I mean, that's the furthest away I can imagine you can get from obviously the career that you ended up on, which is incredible. And were you always into games? Was that like a thing that was going on in the background and you were like, why am I dancing? Like,
oh my God. Why am I dancing is a whole other story where it involves a lot of tears and like begging out of the class. But games were really interesting because I am so old. Early in my life, there were only analog games. And then there was Pong, right? And it was insane. And I can remember, standing in line outside the Sears to get our home Pong machine, and we set it up with a little A/B switch, and it was just the most exciting thing that had ever happened to our family. And there, we got in television and on Atari, we got everything. We got, early, when we got to like the early computer systems, we had a Commodore VIC-20 with like the chiclet keyboard. And then I said, my grandfather bought it for us, and I said, this doesn't have enough memory. I can't program the games that I want to program. So we went out and got a Commodore 64 like 2 weeks later and had a tape drive and everything. And so then we could sit there for hours listening to, we would type something in and wow, 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 wow. There were magazines, obviously, so we could type in and learn how code worked. Right. All this was happening, though, while we were putting on plays in the garage and making films and making all sorts of inventions. We built like a telegraph from the kitchen door to the garage door so that my mom could call us for dinner. And we built like a mail system. And so I think that the games were part of this massive sort of maker world that we all were, myself and my siblings and the folks in my neighborhood were all, it was a time when even, I don't want to say more so, but in many ways more so than today, we had to entertain ourselves and we had all the tools to do it. We had our own Super 8 cameras and we could make all our own little tinker, we didn't have Arduinos, but we made our own little hardware that did stuff. And there wasn't 700 channels of television and the internet. We just had to entertain ourselves. And so it was always making things. And I think that for me, that's, games are just a part of that universe of play and making. That's always been a part of my life.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think it's very interesting that you say that. When I was growing up, imagination was such a huge aspect of anything that I enjoyed, from like playing with Lego, creating a spaceship, and like actually being there. And not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think games in some ways do a lot of imaginatory crafting for kids because you create these incredible worlds. But then,
well, on the other hand, there's things like Minecraft, right? And also, look, they can download these amazing game engines and get to work. Right. Yeah. And they do. I mean, the kids that come to our program, they do. They've all explored and made things. Right. So to me, in many ways, it evens out. The one thing I will say is that we just had to imagine media that we couldn't get. If you believe, like, we saw Star Wars, right? And obviously everyone my age saw Star Wars and it changed their lives. And then there was no access to you when you went home. There was no books, there was nothing, there was no streaming media. So we had to reimagine it every day for ourselves. We would put on plays of the trash compactor scene in the pool. We're like, ducking ourselves, and we would write big storyboards and try to remember every scene that we'd seen, right? And you had to wait years for the next one. You couldn't just watch it and watch it and watch it. You had to wait years for the next one. And so I do think, because that spurred us. Like my first Super 8 film that I ever made was essentially, it was a sequel to Star Wars.
Oh, wow.
Because we didn't have any Star Wars sequels, so we had to make them.
This
right?
sounds great. Where is that now?
It's in the garage somewhere. But we made costumes and we made fake sparkly paint lightsabers with electrical tape on the handles. And I took a rug from the bathroom that was brown. I cut it up. I made a Chewbacca suit for my sister.
That's amazing. That's so cool. I think this is I want to see the tape. Like the tape should
It's actually on Super 8 and I've never gotten it transferred. I always think that I'm afraid to run it through any kind of machine now because, what if it falls apart?
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. I can imagine George Lucas calling you up and being
Oh
like,
yeah, exactly.
you were onto something, you know. Like,
Copyright infringement. Oh, we held screenings. This is where I learned about business. We made a theater in the garage. We screened the film, and we had popcorn. We had a concession stand, and then the next year we did a rescreening of the film in order to earn money for our second film, which was an adaptation of Battlestar Galactica.
So good. This is great.
It was so sick. I'm telling you all my childhood fun stories. It's ridiculous. Okay.
No, it's brilliant. When did you realize that you wanted to get into game design at like an educational level? Because there is a bit of a gap, isn't there?
In the way the question was, I didn't even know, no idea in my head that people made games for a living. As far as I mean, that was just things you did in the garage, or, just hanging out. And when I was growing up, the big thing was to go to film school. After I did the undergrad at Santa Cruz, I went to USC Film School, was the most famous film school, in the world. And I thought I was going to be experimental. I thought I was going to be David Lynch. I was going to be experimental filmmaker, right? What I found, I loved film school and I loved making weird, strange, non-narrative films and stuff like that. But when I found I got out of school was that I didn't much like working in the film industry. I went to some low-level jobs and got ordered around and got a lot of people lunch. Then I went to a weird interview with a tech company that was making this interactive documentary using laser discs, very early video cards, and showing video on a computer. And it's hard to imagine now, but when I saw video running on a computer and I saw, the kind of crazy atmosphere of all these people contribute, I was like, this is for me. So I worked at that company, and then I went on and started working on some cinematic games around the time that those kinds of ideas were coming out. And then I started going into more online games. I built some very early casual multiplayer online games. And I was always doing things that were a little like about 5 years or even more ahead of the curve. So trying to make interactive narratives on laser discs and trying to make this massively multiplayer casual web show for normal people, not tech heads, when there are like 5 people on the internet, right? Seriously. And so, and I started a company trying to do the same thing, like multiplayer interactive television. Before that was really practical. Like, so all the things I was doing were way out ahead of the curve is the idea. So when you ask, like, when did I think about doing this? There were 2 things that happened. One is I was an entrepreneur and I just had beaten myself into the ground, and it was a pretty hard time. I was an entrepreneur during 2001 in a company that depended on marketing dollars. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a big, huge hit in extraneous marketing after 9/11. Our entire business depended on it. And we were a startup and very fragile. I mean, we're doing actually very well and getting all these great innovation awards, and we had an amazing group of people and amazing technology, but you can't withstand a massive cultural shift like that. And when the money goes away, you have to decide where you're going next. So, one of the shifts for me was just financial, right? I had run myself in the ground building this amazing company, and then the world changed. And I went on a 10,000-mile drive. I just literally packed up everything in my car and started driving around the country.
That sounds great. I love it. You're like a nomad, basically. You're like the Dreamcast nomad. You're way ahead of your time.
I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do now? And I started thinking about, what do I love? And I had been teaching almost the entire time that I was working. I had taught as a part-time teacher, even when I lived in New York. And then when I came back to LA, I started teaching one class at USC just every Tuesday night. I would go down there, even in the worst of the startup days, the biggest stress of the startup days, go down there on Tuesday nights and teach. And it was really rejuvenating. It was really great. The students didn't have all those pressures. They just had crazy ideas. And it took me back to my roots of just making stuff in the garage or making, experimental media. And it took me back to my roots, really. And I loved it. I got some, there's nothing like failing, right, to get a whole bunch of great offers. I got some offers from really big companies to come in and do some work similar to what I've been doing with my company, Spider Dance. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, do I want to go do that, but not at my own company? Do I want to go do that kind of thing like for some big conglomerate company, right? Or maybe I just want to teach, maybe I want to go down there and have that Tuesday night experience every day. So I actually went and I pitched to the folks at USC who were just about to start a program in interactive media. I went down there and I pitched this idea for the Game Innovation Lab and for how we could make this games program, and wound up helping to raise the money for that program from Electronic Arts and for the lab, and, really putting my effort in a way it's very entrepreneurial as well, sort of putting my effort into building that program, which is now, one of the top programs in the world.
Wow. That's amazing. It's quite incredible. I had like 4 questions here lined up, like tell us about Spider Dance, tell us what happened to Spider Dance, then tell us about the Game Innovation Lab. But you've in an incredibly like concise way obviously summarized that journey. The Game Innovation Lab is fantastic. And I think it's excellent that you kind of didn't let Spider Dance, you didn't let that be you. You were like, okay, this has happened, but it's not going to be the sum of my parts or like the sum of my ambitions. And I love that you've got into education and teaching. The Game Innovation Lab, I mean, can you summarize it? Can you,
Sure.
we obviously understand how it came about, but summarize what is its objective and what does it do on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So the Game Innovation Lab is a research center around game innovation. And what that means is that it's essentially like a R&D effort. If you had a game studio and you invested in a sort of, a core team of people whose job it was to do R&D on new ideas, right? And our mission is not in technology necessarily, although we've made some cool stuff. Our mission is to really think about the ways that games can be different and go into different spheres of life, right? So, obviously games are fun, they're entertainment. We all love that. That's awesome. But are games other things too? And it, kind of turns out that actually since their earliest days, people have used games to do lots of other things. Like some of the earliest games were meditative, right? They were actual sort of ruminations on fate. Or very early on in the board game industry, this sort of were games that were meant to be instructive or learning games, right? It hasn't always been that games were considered just fun, and it hasn't always been that they were considered just for kids. That's a construction of a kind of marketing effort that happened even after the earliest days of digital games. So early digital games, I mentioned Pong and things like Intellivision and Atari. Those were marketed to families. Those were intended for family experiences. If you look at the advertising, they were family experiences. They were not just for, young boys, for example. Our goal, our mission is to really explore some of these or re-explore some of these areas, and how can games make learning, maybe a less painful experience, a more interesting and engaging experience? How can games help us have better health habits? How can games be political interventions? Things like this, right? Or how can games take their place among the arts that we so respect? Things like film and music and architecture, dance. Games certainly are one of the oldest forms of creative endeavor that humans have invented, and thinking of them as, the sort of playful arts, I think is really interesting and something that we do at the lab. So that's sort of what the lab does. And what we have some folks who are staff in the lab, and then we also have students who are research assistants or student workers in the lab. And we sometimes go out and get funding for games, so from various sources. Sometimes we just noodle on things, and sometimes it's a combination. So one of the earliest examples would be we funded a student research project called Cloud, went on to be that team that made Cloud, went on to become that game company. And so they made many, sort of genre defining games in this kind of idea of sort of reflective and meditative play. And that's been a theme throughout our lab. So we also made a game with the media artist Bill Viola, who's a kind of international video artist, taking me back in many ways to my experimental film roots, working with Bill on a game about the journey to spiritual enlightenment. I already mentioned that many games in the history of games began as sort of spiritual experiences. And so we wanted to make a digital game that explored that realm as well.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and then my most recent game to come out of lab is a game called Walden, a game, which is a game where you play as Henry David Thoreau, the American naturalist and philosopher, living a simple life in nature and discovering or rediscovering what it means to, value our time and not always be grinding for more, but perhaps seeking less.
That's so cool. That's very apt as well for at the moment. You read, it's not like a movement, but there's definitely more voices behind anti-work, right? This like, this way that everyone's like working 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week, and you're living to work rather than working to live.
Yes.
And I think it's really incredible because actually the games that you describe and the games that you've created and worked on are almost, it's very similar to, like, you almost see it as like a metaphor for anti-work in that games nowadays. Often you're having to grind so much before you feel rewarded. And it's pretty cool that you have like almost this genre that's running in equilibrium with this same movement that we're seeing as part of society at the moment.
Yeah. To me, what you just said, living to work rather than, working to live, it's very Thoreau. That's a very Thoreau like statement. And, one of the things I often get is people are like, well, why don't you just go take a walk outside instead of playing a game about a guy who lived in nature. And I'm like, well, that's great. And if people are inspired to do that, to put the controller down and go take a walk outside, then I've done my job. But the other thing is that games themselves, kind of like some music and some ways of meditation, they provide a focus for us to practice that idea of trying to do less, trying to get less, to change our ways a little bit. We had so many people playing the game during the lockdown of the past year. It was incredible. And in fact, we have been working on, and we now have some of the modules in beta, I've been working on educational modules for teachers to use. So the indie game it's on consoles, requires sort of a gaming PC. It's a 6-hour-long open world experience. And teachers love the idea of it, but they don't have that much time in their classrooms, and they don't have PS4s or PS5s, because nobody does. But anyways, they have very old, laptops or sometimes Chromebooks. So we've been working to port small 15 to 30-minute segments of the game focused on their learning goals to Chromebook and low-end web browsers. So that's what we've been doing a lot of that, and supporting tens of thousands of teachers who've written to us during COVID to get the game into their online and hybrid classes. So that's been really fascinating, honestly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I think it's so incredible that you're kind of breaking those boundaries. Do you know what's interesting is, like, because you have a rather unique perspective, right? Like working in education within our industry for over 2 decades. Do you think, given that, and you touched upon it there with like the reach of games throughout COVID, given that it's still an interactive medium, just given it's still there for entertainment, do you think it actually has a responsibility to start addressing some of the political and cultural challenges that we face as a, species, like, across the globe?
Well, it's an interesting question. So I believe in responsible media making, and I don't think it's just game designers and developers who need to engage with that, to be completely frank. I think that many forms of media maybe might want to reevaluate their values. I would say it's not an obligation. I would say that, it's something between a aspiration and a responsibility. What I usually try to do is train game designers who think critically about what it is they're putting out into the world. And if they do that, then they will take some responsibility, and they will be interested in embedding the kind of values that improve people's lives and society in their games. I don't ever want to dictate to anyone what media they should make or consume. That's not my purpose in life. As a creator, as a creative person, and as an educator, I am interested in exploring alternative values. So if you look at something like Walden, at its root is an alternative value system. Most games train us to work hard, get money so we can level up our characters and buy more stuff and, fancier clothes and fancier armor and all that kind of stuff. And it's fun. We think it's fun. I think it's fun. But it also, when I get out in the real world, I take that with me. I take that idea that what am I going to do with my money? I'm going to use it to buy stuff for myself, right? And that's a very shallow, limited set of values. So at the heart of Walden was, we actually lure you in. There are ways to upgrade your stuff, but that only takes you so far in the game. And then you start to realize that there are more important things in life to be worrying about, right? And to be aspiring to. For me, as a creator, I aspire to creating games that have different sets of values embedded in them. As an educator, I hope that I can inspire my students to do the same. But I don't know that I believe that there's an obligation of everyone making media to do the same.
I agree. I was just interested to hear, often you see with film, for example, actually with any creative medium, often it's the same with music, it's criticized when it promotes things that go against the norm.
Right.
Until those things that aren't the norm become the norm, right? Like, as generations can become a bit static in their views, and so they can look at things a bit more critically when they're next gen, if you like. And with games, I think it's very interesting because it's probably got the most influence over a young audience now. And that audience is obviously far more adaptable and approachable for new ways of life, if you like. So it's interesting to hear your views, because obviously you get to see people come through the university, and you get to experience this constant change. And I guess it leads quite nicely on to my next question, which is, in your experience, what has been the major changes to game design over the last 2 decades?
Well, I mean, obviously you could speak to platforms, and you say immediately mobile. Right? The shift from console-dominated industry to a mobile-dominated industry has been, without doubt, the biggest change that's occurred. And what that's done is it's changed the emphasis on what the games are. Console games still are these kind of epic action-adventure games for the most part, right? But mobile games are casual, or even if they are action strategy, they have a casual element to them, right? And they are hitting broader audiences. I think that's very clear, that they're hitting audiences that go beyond just, high school boys, right? The casual audience, the mobile audience is very broad, and in fact, in many ways, heavily skewed towards middle-aged women. So this changes the character of who we're designing for. It changes the character of what situations we are designing for, right? So when do I play a game, and how long do I play it changes when it's in my pocket, and when it's something that I can just play for a few minutes while I'm waiting for a bus or on a bus, right? It's a very, very different kind of experience. I think something that you can point to, which is super interesting, is the most popular games during lockdown. Hands down, early COVID was all about Animal Crossing, right? I mean, it was such a phenomenon. People were going out and buying Switches just to play Animal Crossing. In fact, my elderly mother was like, should I get one?
That's brilliant.
I said, probably not, Mom. You could try mine and see if you like it. But it was fantastic. Like this massive multi-age group, it seemed to cross all boundaries, right? And that's really fascinating to me. So this is a long and short to say that I think that the audience for games is changing. The time and place that we think is appropriate for games is changing. The openness with which people talk about gaming. I mean, never before have we had in the US folks in the Congress who use games to speak to their constituents. It's amazing that any elected leader would come out and say, hey, come meet me in Animal Crossing. Let's talk about the issue.
Oh, yeah. Do you know what? I saw, I can't remember her name. What's the lady's name?
AOC. Yeah.
AOC. Yes. But she logs on. But it's not like...
She plays Among Us, too.
Yeah. But do you know what's amazing is that it's not like she's, just a tourist, if you like. It almost feels like she understands it. She plays. Yeah.
I'm sure she does, actually. Yeah. So I think it's this signpost, if you will, along the way that we always knew, which was that games are going to go back to being for everyone. Everyone has an instinct for play. And just because we've marketed to certain groups, that doesn't kill the instinct. And once we sort of open our minds and our creative minds in making games for a broader public, that they will come and they will play. There's some great benefits, some great underlying tie. It was really interesting to be able to talk to everyone about the water cooler game that they were playing during COVID, right? Well, what are you playing now? In addition to Animal Crossing, there was no baseball. So I myself played MLB The Show until, I was like insane number of hours, probably as many hours I would have spent watching baseball. I played and actually won 2 World Series with my team.
That's amazing. That's so cool. That's like, unfortunately, baseball in the UK, baseball's not really
I know.
It's a non-starter. It's not, but the majority of our audience is actually in America.
You have the two-dimensional version. You have two-dimensional version. You have cricket. It's the two. Yes. Two-dimensional baseball.
It is like that. It is actually very good. It's a very good way of looking at it. I think, it's.
I have to admit, I stole that from my colleague Richard Lamarchand, who's from the UK. And Richard, when I took him to a baseball game, he said, "Oh, it's three-dimensional cricket."
Oh, that's brilliant. This is why it's very unique to obviously have you on the show, because your perspective is that where you can break things down in a very concise way and just say, mobile's changed how we look at things, because mobile, it's really interesting because actually you're obviously entirely right that mobile's broadened video game access, if you like, which in turn has broadened game development. It means developers have to think differently. And I hope that that's a trend that continues. I think sometimes the industry can be a little bit guilty of capitalizing on games that are going to make a lot of money, rather than those that are going to
you don't say.
I choose my words carefully.
What I would hope, honestly, is we saw a tiny little renaissance happen, when the consoles went online, with the PlayStation Now. When the first generation of consoles that sort of had digital downloads, we saw a little renaissance of gameplay. Of course, that has never changed the larger focus of the consoles. And you can see that emphasis on the massive mega IPs churning out the next one and the next one, that has not changed. And I think it's a shame that consoles have not been as influenced by the mobile revolution as they might have been, right? Like I say, there was that sort of revolution, and then they just sort of walked away and went right back to their mega hits. And you have services, obviously, where indies can publish on the console. But as we've seen in the news, it's very hard for those indies to still be found on a console, right?
Yeah. I think
so. They could have been better. I think if those platforms listened a little bit more to the success and the kind of potential shown by the mobile market, that they could have the best of both worlds, right? You look something like the Switch, and I see that kind of real interest in the regular player, not the core audience, but what I call the everyday gamer.
It's hard, isn't it? Because it's almost like a chicken, because it is hard. Like you said, it's hard for developers often to survive. And I think going on console rather than going on PC or mobile is risky. And if you have some success on the PC, I look at a lot of indie games that go on the PC and they won't come out on the console for years. And often that's because it's just a risk. There's like a monetary risk there. Did they market it? Do they then localize it into multiple languages because they're launching it on the console? They have to do submission passes and things like this. But at the same time, I don't think it's going to change until developers actually start thinking, yeah, do you know what? We need to make more casual games for console. I love Nintendo because they stick to their values. Like they're like,
that's right.
We're going to keep to this. And this might not make us the most money. Like they don't have a battle royale, right? Like they don't have a MOBA, but the people that they make games to and the reasons that they make games are because they want to make incredible experiences. And I'm not saying other platforms or publishers don't feel the same. It just feels like often Nintendo embodies this entirely. It's a great ethos for a publisher. I guess what I'd love to know is obviously we talk about like innovation and growth and how well the games industry is doing, but do you think there are any threats? Like I look at music and I look at what streaming did to the music industry, what has done to the music industry, and how they've had to, you've got major record labels have had to completely reevaluate and adapt to how they generate revenue. Obviously now it's done through gigs and like shows and things like this. Do you think there is a threat like that possibly coming to the games industry?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's not entirely within my realm of expertise. It's more of a business question. From my perspective, the largest threat is always a lack of growth. It's always about being stagnant. So when I see stagnant IP, when I see the sort of idea of continually building on old genres of play, I don't think it's a threat so much as I think it's a disappointment, right? The interesting thing about a threat is that we've just been through one of the hugest threats the world has ever faced, and we're still facing it. And the game industry came out smelling like roses. Yeah. Yeah. One of our best years ever. It's crazy. It's similar to the way that the entertainment industry just was the only industry that shone during, the Great U.S. Depression in the 30s. I mean, it's like, it's insane to think of how important games were to people at this great time of isolation and kind of social deprivation almost, right? We're certainly well set up for some of the modern threats, right? Of course, there's other things like privacy and security, and there's a lot of issues around business model. I'm talking about values again, how our values really are expressed in the design of games that tend to take advantage of players' desires and and sort of intrinsic motivations to play. The problem is that those make the industry make more money. So what's the threat? The threat is to people. The threat is to players, right? That we are vulnerable because of our desires to do well in a game, to play well in a game. We're vulnerable to business models that prey on that. So it's kind of like it's an opposite threat. It's not a threat to the industry. It's a threat to the players. If I could wax just a little bit on a theory of mine.
Please do.
So I believe, games are, as I mentioned, they're one of the earliest forms of human entertainment and human, creativity. We create games to play with one another, to test each other, to test ourselves, to challenge ourselves, and ultimately to learn. Interestingly, once we began to replace this sort of social adjudication, right, where you do something, I'm like, no, that's not how the rules go. And you're like, oh, right. Okay, let me take it back and do it again. So that social adjudication where we agree to follow rules together and we watch each other and we agree what the rules are and we enact them, that's an important kind of learning. That's an important kind of learning about how to be a person in a civilized world, in a social system. And the more that we've taken that adjudication out and put it into the hands of AI, a digital game AI, the less we seem to know how to behave as people. In fact, testing the system has taken the place of upholding the system. And you see that played out across the world, this great distrust of social systems and the sense that they are external to us rather than something that we have created and that we ourselves as people of the world maintain in order to have a just society. I'm not saying games are to blame for this, but what I'm saying is as we are children and we learn to play together and we learn to uphold rules together, this is a critical part of our social growth. And I wonder if we don't need to take that into account as we design games, that having us practice that kind of social compact, that sort of social agreement to hold the rules together isn't something that humans need. And we need to practice it from a very young age and continue to practice it as we grow older. So it's highfalutin, I'll give you that. But it's something I've seen for a very long time. And I also see this hunger for board games. And I wonder if that isn't a part of humans reaching out for that very thing, reaching out for that in-person practice, rehearsal, performance of just societies, which is what a little board game group is, right? That's something I think about. So when I think about threats, I'm not necessarily thinking about threats to the industry. I'm thinking about threats to players, right?
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. I think that's a brilliant way of changing the question. The board game renaissance that we're experiencing is fantastic. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it links to mobile games becoming more accessible and that triggering that requirement, like you said, and then that leads again into your theory of having these set rules. Like you said about you, rather than testing, actually taking responsibility almost for the systems that you create.
Right.
And there has to be a cause and effect, right? And I think sometimes games teach you cause, effect, try again, no consequence.
And they teach me to look for loopholes and to exploit those loopholes. And I say, okay, wait a minute here. What I really need to be learning is how, with my neighbor, to have a discussion about our fence, not trying to find a hole through the fence,
secretly moving their fence back a couple of feet. They come back from holiday and they're like, our garden looks smaller. With that theory, I think it also falls into information, right? Everyone has so much more access to information, both factual, fictional, divisive, encompassing. And obviously, I think it's a root of a lot of problems. I don't want to blame them entirely, but I think media has to take a lot of responsibility for that, which it never, ever will. A byproduct of that is actually responsibility and the pressure that it puts on educational institutes and those who teach, because people have got greater access to information and they can do it more autonomously now than ever before. I think it makes actually your role and the objective of educational institutes, which is to impart knowledge and facts, which will help you impart in life, even incredibly challenging. How have you and the USC adjusted to that over the last 2 decades?
Okay, well, I was hoping that you would get to that because, in the beginning of our talk, we talked a little bit about how in this day and age, people can download the tools and they can be making games and, they can come to game school having made several games. They can come to game school having sold games, right? And then, people are like, well, if I can just do it all myself, then why do I have to go to university to learn about it, right? And the answer is, and we do a lot of thinking about what it is that students need to become valuable members of the game development community beyond just great tool jockeys, right? We do a lot of thinking about this, and I'll just use an example from our advanced games class. So in the curriculum, just in very short ways, you start at the beginning learning process, and very small, even analog projects. We start with paper prototyping and, learning some skills. And then we move into intermediate projects where they're slightly larger scope and you do it in partnership. So you start to learn about communication and working well with others, right? Well, by the time they get to their capstone project, which is the final project, there's a capstone at the undergraduate level and a thesis at the graduate level. By the time they get there, one of the large challenges here is for them to execute their ideas within a highly specialized group of people, which is, we think of it as an industry LARP. For those who aren't familiar, a live action role-playing game. Yeah. So in this industry LARP, which is our advanced games program, the students go from pitching ideas. So all students who finish the intermediate classes can pitch their ideas. And in the spring, we greenlight a number of ideas. So for example, 8 ideas get greenlit. And then those students crew up into teams with the various specialities. So they'll have a producer, they'll have a director, they'll have designers, they'll have programmers, artists, user research folks, marketing folks, etc. Right? We even work with the law school that have a legal team on each game. And what they're going to do is they're going to learn about the ins and outs, the everyday ins and outs of what it means to work in a group that size, and what kind of social best practices, as well as skills, because there's skills and there's knowledge, and then there's experience, right? And attitude that will make you a valuable contributor to a team like that. But they go through an entire production process over the course of the next year in which they ship a game. Right? In a team of anywhere from 15 to 30 people, they're going to ship a game. We even have team members that are spread out around the world. There are team members that come from other universities and, for example, art schools or music academies, things like that. So they learn to work distance, different time zones. And a lot of what we do as educators is what I call therapy, right? So for example, I mentor the game directors, and my job is to teach them techniques to become good creative leaders, to create an atmosphere on their team where their team can do the best creative work possible, and to help them through, situations, through problems, through conflict resolution, and help them in a way so that they solve the problem. I'm the coach. I'm sort of like, haven't thought about it from their perspective, right? So let's break down what they're really asking you for, kind of a thing. And so I coach. They have coaches in all the areas of specialities. They have coaches for producers, they have coach for narrative design, coach for game design, for art, the program, for everyone. So we have different coaches in each area. And then the coaches meet and we try to figure out how best we can help the whole team get to where they want to get. So it's fascinating because you can't download that off the internet. So, I've been in the game industry 30 years, and a lot of the other professors have been in the game industry for, equal or more amounts of time. And you can't download that experience. You can't download that kind of coaching and mentorship off the internet. And so in many ways, what we feel our job is to create constrained situations where students can learn things in a serious way. It's emotional, right? And they can learn things you couldn't learn if you read a book about it or watched a video about it or listened to a lecture about it or even had a discussion about it. This is a kind of, like I say, it's a kind of LARP designed for learning, right?
Yeah. I think it's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's challenging, isn't it? Because I look at my son and I think, how much does he learn within his environment at school that isn't equipping him for life? And how much of the information that they get online, is it fact or is it opinion? And it's just interesting to hear. And I think the LARP approach is actually fantastic. And I think that's a really good way of teaching people, especially within our industry where the majority of people are quite introverted. Often guests and I will talk about the challenges the industry faces. And one of the major issues is obviously marginalization, treatment of individuals and teams as well. Actually, there are a lot of stories out there, and it shouldn't be role dependent based on how you're treated. Everyone should be treated as a human and equally. People should know what is right and wrong based on obviously standard morals. And it's incredibly frustrating that isn't just something that everyone just knows what is good and what is not good. What can education do at an earlier stage within your role, for example? How much responsibility falls on education issues? And actually, what can you do, right? Shouldn't people already know this by the time they're reaching you? And
yeah, I think it's a great question. The industry has a couple of things going on. One is that many of the people who've gone into the industry over the years, like you mentioned, have maybe been folks with lesser social skills, right? So introverts, folks who are not really like, the best at negotiating complex social situations. And a lot of times what happens is that builds towards cliques. It builds towards a kind of a situation where in order to make themselves feel safe, they create groups that are exclusive or otherwise pushing some folks away, right? And if that becomes toxic, which it can very quickly, anytime when one group is bonding against another group, it can become toxic very easily, then you have a problem. And of course, we also have the issue that in the industry, for many years, we've had a lack of inclusivity, a lack of diversity in the folks who either wanted to go into it or were able to go into it because they couldn't get past the gatekeeping. They couldn't get past those first steps. And one of the things that education can offer is, first of all, training. We can offer training in that kind of inclusive social thinking and social practice. So I mentioned already this notion of our sort of industry LARP, and a big part of that is training people. We started from day one, but training people to think about their team as folks they want to include, as opposed to thinking about themselves and trying to make themselves feel safe. How do I make everyone on my team feel safe and be able to contribute the best that they can? And you can train this. You can train this through language. I actually have a language game that I do around brainstorming with my students where I train them. It's a game called Yes And. It's based on the classic Yes And theater exercise, but it uses a deck of cards that has opening inclusive language and building language versus shutdown language. And students have a mixture of both in their hands, and they have to play these during a brainstorm in order to add to the brainstorm. So, if you said, what if we made a game about green peas? And I said, yes, and we have multicolor peas too, and that way we could trade peas. And then you might say, oh, yes, and or you might say something like, that's fantastic. And so I give them a set of cards. And then, of course, they also have these red cards in there, which are shut down. So someone else might chime in and say, I don't think that's any fun. Peas are ridiculous, right? And we experience in a safe way what it means to say, but what about this? Or that's too expensive, or that'll take too long, right? Yeah. We experience in a safe way what language means, and I hopefully give them a toolkit of language to use when they want to open up a discussion. That's just one example. And then, of course, as you're building these teams, you want to have more and more techniques that allow people, especially folks who are not speaking up, especially folks who may be different than the majority of folks on team, to have their opportunity to give their best creative input. And then just on the other hand, this notion of who's in the industry, we work hard to diversify our student body because who we send into the industry is going to have an impact on who gets to be in the industry in the next generation. So we've worked hard and for many years have had a completely diverse in terms of gender. So we actually even have slightly more women in our program at this moment than we do men, except on the programming side. But on the other disciplines, it's actually skewed slightly towards women. And programming is not so bad. It's about 2/3 to 1/3. We have many non-binary students, and we are actively trying to support students of color. In fact, we just started a new fund called the Lawson Fund, which is initially backed by Take-Two, and we're actively seeking more people to join it, which is a fund for supporting Black and Indigenous students in game design studies. That's and this excellent. Is really critical. When we first started the program, Electronic Arts, I just want to say, and later Microsoft also created endowments for women game developers and other diverse students. But this new fund is specifically for Black and Indigenous students. And I think it's critical because just quite frankly, being one of the top game programs in the US, we need to offer the program to people who wouldn't be able to come to a school like USC. It's a private school. It's an expensive school. Many of the top game programs are expensive. Even the public schools are expensive for out-of-state students. So we need to make a concerted effort to do better at supporting students of color.
I mean, it's brilliant. I think it's fantastic that you've identified that as well, right? Like, not obviously, like you could say it's an obvious problem, but actually it's the solution that's the hard part. It's like, okay, cool. So how do we go about this? And it's great to hear that obviously you have some, unfortunately, some of these publishers like EA, for example, are often demonized, you could say, among like player communities. But it's fantastic to hear that actually they're working with you on this. I think it's also great to hear that you actually have. I love the P game.
I don't even know where that came from.
But no, but it's brilliant. The challenge for educational institutes and people like yourself, I think, is going to continue for quite some time. And I think that obviously your responsibilities will increase with that, because I suppose it's consistency, isn't it? It's maintaining change, positive change. I think often like these things trend and then they drop off, and it's infuriating because you're never going to make it to the end of the pool if you only swim halfway, right? You're going to drown. That's a terrible example, but like, it's great to hear. I think that kind of brings us to the end of what's been like an incredible episode. It's been fantastic having you on.
Yes, it's been a really fun conversation.
It's been so good. Yeah. It's so good. And yeah, thank you very much. And for everyone listening, just a quick note. Obviously, you can contact us at thegamedevshow@ptw.com. All the views that you've heard here today are of both Tracy and my own, and do not represent our employers. Thank you.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
You too.
Game over.